It's just about 6 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second installment of our virtual speaker series. My name is Kristen Norton. I am the Executive Director at the Laurel Historical Society, and I am joined tonight by Jimmy Rogers. Before I get into the formal introductions, I do want to quickly go over just some general housekeeping. Tonight's program is in the webinar format, so we invite you to please submit any questions you might have to the Q&A feature, usually found at the bottom or sometimes along the sides of your screen, depending on your device. We will get to the questions at the very end of the program. I'll also be monitoring the chat should you wish to submit any comments or questions that way as well. As a reminder, we are recording tonight's program, so please be on the lookout for a link to view the recorded presentation sometime early next week, and then it will be posted to our YouTube channel shortly thereafter. Now, to our formal introduction, I'm joined tonight by Jimmy Rogers. He is a native gardening consultant in Laurel, a resident of Laurel, and a longtime partner with the Laurel Museum. He is a passionate advocate for creating native gardens in our community, and we are delighted to have him here tonight. Jimmy, I hand the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. All right. Well, hello, everybody. Like I said, thank you for having me. Laurel Historical Society. Thank you for hosting a talk on this topic, which is one of my favorites, which is native plants and gardening for wildlife. And it has been great working with the Laurel Museum staff over the years. So I'll be talking a little bit about that as well. All right. So what we're going to cover tonight. First, we've got just a lot of great information to share, so I'm going to try to move quickly. We'll go through some introductions, talk a little bit about the museum zone gardens, and then dive into the hows and whys of creating your own vibrant garden. After that, we'll answer any questions we have time for. Also, I'll be sharing these slides, and this meeting is also being recorded. So if there's anything you see on the slides, you'll get that afterward. So as you heard, my name is Jimmy Rogers. I'm a native gardener in Laurel, Maryland. In my day job, I'm a project manager, which is convenient because gardening and planning go hand in hand. I'm also a certified Chesapeake Bay landscape professional, or CBLP, which covers the intersection between gardening, landscaping, ecology, and stormwater management. I'm the Gardens Project Manager with our local ecological group here, Laurel for the Patuxent. L4P is a nonprofit that works to conserve the Patuxent River as well as its watershed, which includes all of the homes and woods and animals and plants and people in and around the greater Laurel area. Also, if you live in the Laurel area, you might get the Laurel Independent. They're kind enough to let me publish a native gardening column each month. If you're interested, my latest column is on common native gardening myths, which you may hear some of those tonight. And next month, I'm going to be covering great educational opportunities for gardeners. Lastly, it might surprise some of you to hear I'm the president of a small HOA, Patuxent Triangle, actually just around the corner from the museum. Most folks see HOAs as against conservation-oriented landscaping. However, that's starting to change, both due to Maryland's state law allowing residents to garden for wildlife in HOAs, and because HOAs are themselves realizing that they benefit from better water and land management. After several years of learning and volunteering as much as I possibly could, I realized the only way I could do more was to start a business. So that's why I started Vibrant Gardening. Originally, I thought I'd want to design and build gardens like a typical landscaping company. I quickly realized that if I did everything for people, my clients wouldn't know their new plants, they wouldn't know how to take care of them or how to curate their own garden over time. So instead of selling gardens, I focused on working with homeowners to help them become native gardeners. I offer on-site and virtual consultations as well as garden design, plant sourcing, and project management services. I've enjoyed a partnership with Laurel Historical Society and the Laurel Museum helping them integrate native plants into their landscape. The project at the Laurel Museum began with what I believe was a casual conversation with Ann Bennett, the former museum director, and Brian Coyle with L4P. The garden beds had a few plants, mostly bare mulch, and they talked about native plants as an option. Brian reached out to me, and together we met with Ann and her staff, walked around the whole property, and we wanted to just see what was already there. And from there, we chose some native species, got the ground ready, and invited community members to plant the garden beds. We did a detailed presentation about the project in 2024. So for all those project details, I invite you to check out a link to that recording on YouTube. Today's talk is a lot more about what you can do in your own garden. This year, we invite everyone to come out to plant some natives in the garden surrounding the Laurel Museum. We'll be planting this Saturday from 10 to noon. We have about 140 plants from among 17 species to add to what we already have in the garden. This will fill in more ground cover, fill out the bloom coverage, and increase species diversity. Please wear work clothes, any gardening tools you might use for planting, and bring a water bottle. Also, please visit laurelforthepatuxent.org/forms to fill out the volunteer waiver and photo release for us. And thanks to the volunteers last weekend who helped us weed the garden ahead of time. So I really appreciate having some folks come out. All right. So to start a discussion about gardening for wildlife, I want to share why I chose the name vibrant gardening, where the vibrant come from. Whenever we're in the growing season, I spend a lot of time walking through my garden. Each week, there are new plants emerging and blooming. However, for me, the plants are just the first layer of the garden. As soon as I wake up, I see our native bees busily gathering pollen and nectar. Even colorful flowers seem twice as alive when a bee is foraging for their pollen. Butterflies are also attracted to my garden. I see at least 10 species of butterfly or their caterpillars each year. And while we might not see them as much in the daytime, there are many moths and their caterpillars as well. All of this attracts tons of songbirds looking for insects or seeds. And there are countless other animals like skinks and several generations of bunnies that have grown up in my front yard. So when I say vibrant, I mean the combination of animals and their host plants that bring my garden to life. So how can you add vibrancy to your own garden? What I'll be sharing today are my personal principles for approaching native gardening. We're going to step through them one at a time, but for the audio files in the room, I'm going to read them out loud first. 1, garden for wildlife. 2, take responsibility for stewarding your land. 3, take cues from the environment. 4, learn the facts from objective sources. 5, pursue your projects at a sustainable and healthy pace. And gift your time, knowledge, and plants to others. If you approach gardening this way, I guarantee you'll bring more life into your garden than you could ever buy at a nursery. All right, the first step is to garden for wildlife. Before we can even begin thinking about the garden, we need to understand some details about our ecosystem. So let's start with native plants. All right, so to make sure our terms are clear, native plants are plants that naturally occur in a place. That means we need to define the place or where we are ecologically. Many folks are familiar with the USDA plant hardiness zones like 6B, 7A. However, those zones stretch all the way across the country and don't say much about the unique ecology in our area. Native gardeners tend to focus on their watershed and their ecoregions. Maryland falls almost entirely within this larger blob here, which is the Chesapeake Bay watershed, meaning almost every drop of water that lands in Maryland eventually flows into the bay. From there, Maryland is divided into 3 ecoregions: coastal plain, Piedmont, and mountain. If you look at the map, you can see a little red X here. That's where Laurel is, and you can see we are positioned right on the line between the coastal plain and the Piedmont. That means broadly, Laurel's native plants and are the plants that scientists have observed as native to those two Maryland ecoregions. All right. It's easiest to understand how native plants drive the rest of the ecosystem by looking at examples. Common violets here in the upper left, they are native to Maryland and an excellent early season bloomer. They host the caterpillar of the fritillary butterfly. Here we see an adult on butterfly milkweed, which is their favorite nectar source. They are important pollinators. Humans love them. This picture is from my front yard, and I can tell you I'm always delighted to see them. Native winterberry, down in the bottom left, hosts the caterpillar of the Harris's three-spot moth, kind of funky looking caterpillar. From this stage, it will either become a moth or prey for a bluebird feeding its young. Caterpillars, particularly moth caterpillars, are the most important food source for baby birds who can only eat live prey, no bird seed. But what if we try to use common non-native plants instead? So if we replace the violets with Liriope, which is from Asia and has no host relationships with our insects, it will produce no fritillaries or any other butterflies. If we replace the winterberry with Nandina, also from Asia, there will be no host in our garden for the moth caterpillar, and so no adult moths or food for songbirds. In fact, the Nandina has berries that are toxic to our songbirds, and cedar waxwings are known to gobble them up without knowing the danger, which can lead to their deaths. And this is about where we are today. Most of our gardens are made up of non-native plants. And so a breakdown of the ecosystem has been happening more and more. In the last 50 years, we've lost about a third of our birds. And this is, you might say to yourself, well, this is all too bad, but that's what the woods are for. Wildlife lives in there and then comes and visits our bird feeders and some of our plants. And you'd be absolutely right if we hadn't disrupted or destroyed 95% of the original habitat in the United States. So unless we do something different going forward, we are going to lose most of our insects, birds, and other residential wildlife, which expands out to most of our wildlife. What I've just shared is the absolute tip of the iceberg, and if you're interested in learning more, I recommend either reading Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home or watching one of the many recordings of his talk, Nature's Best Hope. Most of the native gardeners I know have read the book, and it lays out the problem we're facing, what kinds of home gardening practices have been shown to actually make a difference. So it's a great resource, and I would recommend it. Okay, so we understand a little bit about the importance that native plants play in supporting our wildlife. What's next? For any garden, you first need to identify plants by their light, moisture, and soil requirements. There are many more details you will eventually learn as a gardener, but these will always steer you in the general right direction. For light, I consider sun to be strong light for at least half the day. If there are any trees casting partial shade, then it's part sun or part shade. I don't really distinguish between part sun and part shade. If there's a lot of shade throughout the day, either because it's blocked or by blocked by a structure or under heavy tree canopy, then it's full shade. Fortunately, many natives are very adaptable and can survive more shade than expected. If they're in moist conditions, they may also be able to survive more sun than expected. So for moisture, I tend to always assume a spot is dry until I see evidence that I'm wrong, especially in residential spaces. If it's rained a few days ago and the soil is still wet to the touch, then it's a moist spot. If the ground is actually squishy and there's often water when you press on the ground, then I would call that wet. And if you have an area like a rain garden that periodically holds water, or even if you have a pond, you might look for plants that can tolerate or even thrive in full inundation. Lastly, I don't spend too much time on soil type, simply because there is so much complexity to soil. Many plants can tolerate a large variety of soil conditions. The main thing I check for is whether a plant is predominantly found in sand or is particularly intolerant of clay. And for those who often give clay a bad rap, remember that we have tons and tons of clay-loving natives to choose from. One more thing about soil, please do not start a gardening project by immediately amending the soil with compost, fertilizer, or anything else. If you're gardening with native plants, the best strategy is to find plants that already want to live in your soil. Put another way, no one's out in the wild areas amending that soil, so you probably don't need to either. All right, so you've chosen an area to plant and identified the conditions you need to choose some plants. Or sorry, identified the conditions. So now you need to choose some plants. You can start by making a list of interesting native plants to try out in your garden, or by going somewhere that sells native plants and looking around. There are some pitfalls to avoid while shopping. The first thing you need to know is that seeing native on a pot or a plant tag tells you next to nothing. Most big box stores or even fancy garden centers are selling plants that are roughly native to a region or just somewhere native in the United States. If I go down to a native plant section in a typical Maryland nursery, I could probably identify about half of them as not being native to Maryland. Fortunately, we have a new state program called the Maryland's Best Native Plants Program that serves two purposes. The first is to start to identify retailers and growers who are selling plants that are native to Maryland, as well as ranking them by how much of their stock is native. That list is now on the Maryland's Best website and is growing. And you'll find Vibrant Gardening is on there as a gold tier retailer. They've also compiled a comprehensive list of native plants to Maryland that are available for sale, along with a lot of information about each plant. So, as best as you can, choose plants that are native to Maryland. Next, try to buy straight species, which are varieties that are close to what is found out in the wild. Most of the nursery trade is made up of cultivars, which are selections for special flowers and leaves and growth patterns. Usually they'll have kind of a cute marketing name like October Skies in quotes. And while there are some cultivars that seem to be valuable for wildlife, many break the million-year relationships they have with our wildlife. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. If you can, try to find growers in Maryland. If you've ever heard shop local, why not for native plants of all things? Even better with a local grower. You'll have a chance of finding local ecotype plants, meaning they are genetically like the plants found in our region. Believe it or not, native bees in Maryland actually have a preference for plants with local genetic traits. Plus, who will be able to give you better advice than a local grower of local plants? Above all, the best practices that I'm listing here, they're just practices. I recommend you aim for them, do the best you can. Like everything else, you'll probably not be able to get it, perfectly right, perfectly, in alignment here. And that's okay. The most important thing is to know what to do and why to do it, and then aim in the right direction when you can. So let's do a quick side-by-side comparison. The flower on the left is quite striking. There are red petals, a yellow center, and the stems and leaves are dark purple, almost black sometimes. This is a cultivar of our native false sunflower, Heliopsis helianthoides. Here is what the straight species looks like. It's quite striking, the difference. So this cultivar on the left, which is readily found at many nurseries in our area, is broadly derived from the same species, but comes from a naturally occurring variety, Scabra, which is not found in Maryland. Additionally, this is a mutant of that variety of that species. So it's several steps away from what naturally grows here, even though it's found in the native plants section. The nursery industry grows this mutant as a part of their stock and has named it bleeding hearts for marketing purposes. On the straight species, you'll notice the petals are bright yellow and the stems are a more typical color of green. That means that the bees and butterflies that have a relationship with false sunflower may not as easily recognize the flowers on the cultivar, and it may have changed how it produces pollen and nectar for them. Plus, the dark leaves are caused by some kind of pigment, which may deter some of our local caterpillars, beetles, and other leaf eaters. I have seen some insect damage on the leaves of this plant periodically, though that may be from more generalist insects, not necessarily with a close relationship. Also, in all the years I've grown the plant on the left, it has never made another of its kind. That's because it's almost certainly a sterile cultivar. Compare that to the one on the right. I now have a huge stand of these in my front of my porch, and they have spread to other parts of the garden, which would never have happened if it was sterile. And I got the straight species for free from a neighbor. So while striking in appearance, the one on the left is ecologically drifting away from our purpose as wildlife gardeners. Put all this into perspective, let's take a look at a few different species and see how they fit into the spectrum of wildlife value. And before I get started, while most plants offer some nectar, we're mostly focused on whether each plant is likely to increase or decrease the amount of wildlife in an area, which includes those close relationships. So as we discussed, this is false sunflower. It's a straight species and is very valuable to a wide variety of insects and seed-eating birds. These are often referred to as contributors, as they actively contribute to the creation of more animal life. Our bleeding hearts cultivar from before, it diverges significantly from local flora, if it could even be considered native in the first place, and its value to wildlife has been brought into question. Here is an ordinary rosebush, likely originating in Asia. It is a non-native and is, as of yet, a non-invasive ornamental. These are often termed as non-contributors because they don't don't create more wildlife through host relationships. When I see non-contributors through the eyes of wildlife, they do start to look a little more like these. And lastly, we have Vinca minor, or periwinkle, which is not native to Maryland and extremely invasive in our woods and along our waterways. It not only has no local host relationships with wildlife, but it contributes to habitat loss as it takes over space that would have otherwise be home to valuable native plants. And so we term these as invasives. So that's kind of like the landscape of, contributors, non-contributors, and these detractors or invasives. If you're just starting out, native plant shares are a great option. These are community-led gatherings of gardeners who have extra plants in their gardens, or sometimes grow plants specifically for an event and want to share those plants with others. These are generally not swaps, meaning you don't need to bring anything to get something. In fact, other gardeners will usually encourage you to take a lot of stuff, provided you promise to plant it, and because they don't want to have it to take it back home at the end of the day. I personally have made a ton of friends at these events. It's also nice to look at a plant and remember who gave it to you, or later see your own plants growing in someone else's garden. You can find a pretty good list of plant shares at the Maryland Native Plant Society website, mdflora.org. And also the vast majority of them are posted on Facebook, so I recommend doing a search there. All right. I know that was a lot of information, and I want to make it clear that no one expects you to absorb all that at once if you're trying to get into native gardening. The main takeaway is that native plants drive the rest of our ecosystem. So if you can plant them in your garden, you will actually help your local wildlife. Once you have that mindset, you can move forward to our second principle, take responsibility for stewarding your land. So that means if you own a piece of land, you don't just live there, you're responsible for what happens to the other living things there. Before starting a new garden project, I recommend you become familiar with everything that's already on your property. Get one of the many phone apps. I like PlantNet. A lot of people use iNaturalist, and start identifying everything as well as you can. If you visit one of Maryland's native gardening groups on Facebook, they'll help you identify tricky plants as well. If you have any trees on the property, I recommend you not only identify them, but for the natives in particular, make sure they're healthy. Have an arborist out, which costs nothing for a consult, and ask them for some professional advice. A 70-year-old tree is going to do a lot more important things for our ecosystem than 10 new saplings. You might also already have more native species than you think on your property. When I worked with the Laurel Museum on their gardens, for example, they had a willow oak on the left-hand side here, and several winterberry hollies across the front that I helped build their gardens around. Also, anything that's already growing on your land is something to pay attention to in the future when planning gardens. This can give you clues to the growing conditions. You can start identifying the invasives on your property. Here you can see a huge amount of English ivy that's creeping up the wall of this museum. Lastly, if you have any water issues with erosion or ponding on your property, those are good things to look at before creating new garden beds. Otherwise, you might have to undo your own work later. Oops. And if you're wondering, here's a little after picture of after we kind of went through that project. All right. Let's clarify what we mean by invasive species. They're any species that is not native to an area and causes harm to people, wildlife, or the economy. The term sometimes is used by gardeners to mean it spreads rapidly, but that leads to confusion. So I strongly recommend using aggressive or even gregarious when talking about fast spreading plants. Now that we have a definition, let's talk about how they impact our forests. Some of them simply grow out of control. Porcelain berry above and kudzu below are both problems along the Patuxent River, and they will block any light from reaching the forest canopy, let alone anything below that. Even before they get that big, though, they will start causing diseases on the plants they cover. I often hear, "Oh, but this one is so pretty." And they are. Here's porcelain berry. Almost all of our invasives were brought here because we liked how they looked. We need to learn to love our thousands of beautiful native plants instead. There are also many invasive shrubs for sale in Maryland nurseries, such as barberry, which I've personally seen covering a quarter-mile of what once was wild meadow. And they also are a habitat for ticks. If any of this sounds like a problem, there are some clear actions you can take to make sure your yard doesn't make things even worse. Do not buy invasive plants. Identify them where they already are in place, and as much as you are able, remove them and dispose of them properly, and then replace them with native plant species. This last one is important because if you leave bare ground, you're inviting all the seeds dropped by that invasive over the years to all germinate at once. Native plants can be very effective in slowing the recurrence of invasive species when planted in place of those species. The Maryland Extension is a really good resource if you're looking for information on a specific invasive and eliminating it. So I would just say, visit the Maryland Extension for that kind of information, or you can reach out to me and I can try to help you. Fortunately for everyone here, we can all participate in the Master Gardener's Baywise program, which it takes a much broader look at your outdoor space, not just covering your garden areas, but also turf grass, stormwater, and other environmental considerations. It's a free program for homeowners, and at the end, your yard will be certified as Baywise, which is a great way to show curious neighbors, yes, I put some thought into this new kind of garden that you're seeing. I really enjoyed doing Baywise myself, and even though I had done a lot of research as I was developing my own garden, I definitely learned some things from them during their site visit. I'm going to kind of go through some just good practices I want to make sure everybody leaves here with. So here's 4 of them. First, in the fall, look for opportunities to leave the leaves. You can rake leaves out of pathways and into garden beds. Let leaves accumulate on your lawn as long as you can still see the blades of the grass poking through. And keep in mind that this is where your pollinators and fireflies go during the winter. You don't want to sweep them all up and throw them away. In the spring, resist cleaning up the garden too early or too much. So you can let your garden sleep in until the nights are reliably in the 50s. You can leave your leaf litter indefinitely. You never need to remove it. It's great for wildlife. And if needed, you can cut the stems to knee height, about 18 inches, in late March to leave them for stem nesting bees. 20% of our native bees are stem nesters. And obviously, if you have things in pathways and those kinds of issues, you can clear those out ahead of time. But deeper in your garden, you can leave them longer. You want to make sure your exterior lights are bird friendly. So light that shines up into the sky is not only wasted, it also confuses migratory birds, which we know leads to their deaths. So make sure lights are shielded and don't use upward facing lights like those used for illuminating trees. And then the big one is avoid pesticides, except in rare spot applications. And this includes herbicides and insecticides. So don't broadcast weed and feed on your lawn. Don't hire mosquito spray companies as they kill large numbers of beneficial insects, including pollinators. Okay, so we know what a native plant is, we know why it's important, and how to take care of our land. We're ready to start designing a garden. However, we're not looking through a catalog of Italian gardens from 200 years ago. We're going to take cues from our environment for design inspiration. So the first thing to think about in a new garden is whether, if I'm thinking about I want to mimic forest, verge, or meadow. So forests have big canopy trees, usually a lot of shade, and there aren't an enormous number of plants growing at ground level. Meadow is the kind of grassland we have here. These tend to have grasses and herbaceous plants with the occasional shrub or tree. And then in between these two landscapes is the verge. It's not usually super deep, but it's an interesting transition zone where there's usually more shrubs and understory trees connecting the meadow to the forest. This is actually a big gap in our gardens because developers cut the forest and then abruptly stop. So they're clear cutting, they stop, they put down grass right to the forest edge. And our natural landscapes have a more gradual transition. And that's the goal for native gardening projects. In fact, it's a great, especially if your house backs up to the woods, you can really increase that gradual transition from herbaceous plants to shrubs, to understory trees, to canopy trees. And that's really helpful for wildlife. All right, we're gonna get into some design tips. I know people always want to know, that little useful thing in the garden. Um, Once I know what I'm trying to mimic, that can start to inform my plant choices. The first plants I focus on are ground covers. These are usually semi-evergreens, stay relatively low, and form enough foliage to prevent weed seeds from germinating in early spring. They're particularly important in meadow-like gardens where the amount of sun means there's a lot of energy to germinate those weed seeds and make them grow. So here's some go-to examples I use in almost every garden. On the left is Pachyra aurea, or golden ragwort, which can handle a lot of conditions except for very hot, very dry conditions. Big bloom in March, April. In the middle are plantain leaf pussy toes, Anatenaria plantaginifolia, which can handle a very dry, sunny climate. I caught an American painted lady laying her eggs on her host plant here, and this was at the museum garden when I was weeding it one day. And on the right are golden alexanders or Zizia aurea that can handle very dry, sunny conditions and will bloom throughout most of the year. And they will host black swallowtails. So if you plant a ground cover plant every 1 to 2 feet in a new garden, they will claim the ground and you won't need to add mulch every year. Without a ground cover layer, you are not only opening yourself up to weed pressure, but your garden will also not resemble a native landscape. If you're designing a garden with walkways, it's important that plants aren't leaping toward passersby. So here's an example of a beautiful patch of black-eyed Susans that are leaning into the sidewalk. To many of us gardeners, this isn't a huge deal, but for folks who have only seen formal gardens, it can evoke a sense of disorder. Also, when you're intruding on public spaces such as sidewalks, we want to be mindful of folks who might have a hard time using that sidewalk if it's blocked by a bunch of floppy stems. So when you're standing on the edge of a bed, look at what you've planted 1 foot in and make sure it won't fall over more than a foot. And if you're 2 feet in, make sure that won't fall over more than 2 feet, and so on. Also, I've seen this example on the right here at the Friends School in Baltimore, where they weed the first 6 inches and cover it with a little mulch, and then they go pretty wild beyond that. The stanchion there isn't really holding back the grasses as much as they're just very upright. So really interesting technique. So there is a huge amount of very mediocre gardening information out there. Most of it comes from bad patterns started in gardening books or sorry, in the gardening industry and landscaping industry that have made their way into books and blogs and TV specials, etc. The number of invasive species that are top sellers at nurseries is a good example of one of these bad patterns. So if you're going to have a vibrant garden, you have to know the facts and learn them from objective sources. Fortunately, many ecologists are working very hard to get their findings out to as many people as possible and in an actionable format. Here's an example of how objective facts help me not only with clients, but also with friends and neighbors. Various invasive species like butterfly bush, vinca, clematis, and nandina come up in conversation or during a visit to someone's garden, and folks invariably say, I know you don't like these, but. And here's the thing, I've spent a non-trivial amount of time removing these plants from home gardens and the woods surrounding those gardens. However, it's not because I don't like them. It's because ecologists have measured the damage they do to our environment, wrote up papers, and then stood on the mountaintops shouting and hoping somebody else would care. And I should add, they didn't get paid enough to do it. And believe it or not, there are some native plants that I don't love the look of, and I don't tend to plant them in gardens. But if someone else asks me about that plant, I can say, yes, here it says there are 3 different pollinators that need that plant to survive. And it's not just the case for, it's just not the case for non-native plants, let alone non-native invasive plants. So we need to focus on natives. I'm just going to kind of share, you can pick these up from the slides later. They'll be sent out next week, but these are some great books I've read that have really informed my journey. Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy, Our Native Bees by Paige Embry, Planting in a Post-Wild World by Rayner and West. A lot of the design stuff I talk about is in there. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. The research was done just 30 minutes away in the Patuxent Research Refuge. Sand County Almanac is just like a love letter to the land. And The Human Gardener is one of our local luminaries, Nancy Lawson in Howard County. And I'll humbly submit my own articles for your reference. I really try to answer the questions that I hear the most in those articles. So you can click through the archive link and see all the articles I've done for the local paper. I do want to provide some insight into how to figure out nativity, AKA whether something is native to a particular place. It is pretty tricky for new gardeners to figure this out. There's 2 really good resources for, one of them is nativeplantcenter.net. which is sort of like a simple website for looking up plants native to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And the other is the newly available commercial native plant list from the Extension Service. Kind of a long link here, but it's currently a Google Doc. I think it's going to become a database eventually, but I use this every single day when I'm doing design. And there's lots of columns to the right here with lots more information. So this is just a little screenshot of that. And if you're a nativity nerd like me, FloraQuest is a wonderful phone app. You can buy once and then reference range maps for each of the species in our region, or see that it's not in our region. You'll get little indicators on the map there. And lastly, I do want to put out a word of warning. If you've ever looked up the native range for a plant and gotten a website called Bonap, the Biota of North America, I would recommend avoiding it, as a lot of the data in there is kind of messy and it can lead to some wrong conclusions. All right. Once you're getting started, you want to pursue your projects at a sustainable and healthy pace. In other words, take very small bites. Now, let me say, you could design an entirely new garden to go in your front yard, bring in 20 cubic yards of arborist wood chip, smother for 5 weeks, and then have an 8-hour planting marathon on your birthday, uh, and get this to happen. And it would really be one of the most interesting years of your life. Here's what it looked like over the summer. But that really isn't the best project for most people. You might get halfway through, get overwhelmed, run out of steam, and then you run into that thing where you're like, maybe I can't garden after all. And what I want for everyone I know and work with is have little bites of success. So I tend to recommend projects of 100 to 300 square feet for folks creating new garden beds, especially if you have to smother lawn first to do it. Here's a good example of that size of bed. It's the design for part of an HOA garden project that I led in my little home HOA. And you can see a picture of our first spring on the right of the same bed. You don't have to be a graphic artist or a landscape architect to write down where you're going to plant natives. One of the biggest takeaways that I got working at a digital design agency was to spend as little time and money as possible on design documents. While design is super important, all designs undergo change, sometimes significant change, by the time they become a real tangible product. So getting designs good enough to start building something has to be the primary goal. Regardless of your background, your 100th design is going to be better than your first. So I advocate for designing lots of small gardens so you can build your skills. For my garden designs, I build out planting plans of 1-foot squares in Google Sheets. Really not much more complicated than that. All right, this last principle isn't so complicated. Once you can do something, gift your time helping others. Once you know something, gift your knowledge to help others solve problems. And once you have grown lots and lots and lots of plants, which is what will happen in a native garden, gift those plants to others who are building their own gardens. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. That was a really interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. My husband did too, who was stealthily watching in another room. I do see there are actually a couple questions already in the Q&A. The first one is, when is the best time to plant?
That's a great question. I would say that the conventional wisdom is plant their best planting time is in the fall, because you have passed through the heat of summer, and plants are both very easy to plant in the cooler, like now is a great time to plant, because you can get out there, it's not too cold yet. And then all through the winter, those plants will settle in and then they will start in spring. The next best time to plant is in spring. After you actually don't have to wait till risk of last frost, or risk of last frost, with natives because many of them are quite cold adapted. So you can really plant anytime in the spring as well. But the main thing is that once summer comes on, you are going to need to be paying more attention to that heat, especially if you're planting toward the end of spring.
Great. And then there's one other question as well. And they may have submitted this mid-presentation, perhaps before you shared the extension resource, but it's where can I find a list of native pollinator plants?
Yeah, I think your best go-to is the commercial list or nativeplantcenter.net. Those are in the slides that I mentioned. Um, just to clarify that term, because I do want to make sure everybody feels like they know what terms mean. Really, like all plants, like well, a vast majority of plants have some kind of pollinator relationship. If you're looking for plants that specifically attract bees and butterflies and moths, then we can call those pollinator plants kind of in the common term. And what I would look for there is plants that have either a lot of or large showy flowers, because those are plants that are putting a lot of energy into attracting pollinating insects. So that's kind of I would look for that, and I would look for those lists. And then the other thing is try to get lots of bloom times, different times of the year. So you're not getting all your blooms in July, but you don't have much going on in May, or you don't have much going on in November. Those are all great times to grow flowering plants as well.
Oh yeah, that's a great suggestion. So you have a beautiful garden year round and happy birds and bees and all sorts. There's a couple questions from Mark. The first is, can you mix native seeds with others?
Hi, Mark. We I think we've talked a little bit about native seeds in the past. If you're, if you're just growing seeds out in like a winter sowing context, usually you keep those by species so you can identify them later. If you're just scattering seeds like in a small plot, maybe you're adding that to a planting of perennials and you're scattering seeds. If you want to add I'm assuming you mean native seeds and non-native seeds. As long as it's not an invasive species in Maryland, go for it. They'll come up together and they'll battle it out. So a lot of people like to plant zinnias, for instance. They're non-native, non-invasive. That is a large showy flower. You could mix those in with black-eyed Susans, and they'll both germinate. And I
Okay.
think you're just alluding to winter sowing, so I'll just mention that really quickly. Basically, winter sowing is a great technique. You can start planning for it now because you can do this at as soon as the solstice, the winter solstice. You get milk jugs, cut them in half. You can open that up kind of like a I don't know, like a sandwich. Fill the bottom with potting soil, take native seeds, put them on top, water in nice and densely. I should mention that you need holes in the bottom and holes in the top, and you take away the cap, tape it all up, put it outside, and it'll germinate. And I know I'm rushing through that description, but I strongly recommend people take a look at a video online called All the Dirt on Winter Sowing. It's put out by the Master Gardeners. And I think some people on the call may even have contributed to that. And I just can't recommend that enough as a great introduction to that technique. Great way to grow a lot of plants over the winter and spring.
Okay. Well, I don't see any questions lurking in the chat, and I don't see any more in the Q&A feature. Oh, nope, I lied. Oh,
That's Marlene who helped create the all the dirt videos. So thank you, Marlene.
well, seeing no other questions, I guess I will just express my thanks and gratitude to you, Jimmy, for that wonderful presentation, and for all you do for the Laurel Historical Society. Again, I invite you all who are joining us tonight to come out on Saturday morning at 10 a.m. If you fill out your form at the Laurel for the Patuxent website, of course, and get some hands-on experience with an expert on site. And then, of course, I invite you to come to the museum over the next few months as our garden kind of takes shape. And please save the date as well. We have one more speaker series webinar coming up in October on Thursday, October 23rd. And that one will be on the Patuxent Research Refuge then and now. So an overview of some natural history and human history, and we'll have a couple speakers from the refuge joining us. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you again, Jimmy. I wish you all a very happy Friday Eve, and we hope to see you in person sometime soon, maybe this Saturday or sometime thereafter. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.